When we think of how World War III might begin, our minds often jump to nuclear launches or terrorist attacks. But history tells a different story. Both previous world wars began with border disputes that spiraled out of control. Today, 5 powder kegs are scattered across our planet. Flashpoints where centuries-old grievances, modern military buildups, and geopolitical ambitions collide. These aren't just lines on a map. They're fault lines in our global security system. I've spent years studying these flashpoints, and what I've discovered will change how you see the world map forever. These aren't distant problems. They're ticking time bombs that could reshape your life overnight. Let's explore the 5 borders where World War III could ignite at any moment. Imagine standing on Taiwan's western coast. On a clear day, you can almost see mainland China across the water. This 110-mile stretch of ocean, barely wider than the distance between Los Angeles and San Diego, has become the most dangerous body of water on Earth. Why does this small island matter so much? The story begins in 1949, when communist forces took control of mainland China, forcing the defeated nationalist government to retreat to Taiwan. Since then, Beijing has considered Taiwan a breakaway province that must be reunified, by force if necessary. But Taiwan's importance goes far beyond historical grievances. This narrow strait is the maritime highway for global commerce. Over half the world's container traffic passes through these waters annually. Any conflict here wouldn't just be a regional problem, it would instantly become a global economic catastrophe. Even more critically, Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of the most advanced chips. These aren't just for your smartphones and laptops. They power military systems, automobiles, medical devices, virtually everything in our modern world. A Chinese military analyst once called Taiwan the world's semiconductor factory. If production stopped due to conflict, global supply chains would collapse within weeks. Your car wouldn't get built, hospital equipment wouldn't get replaced, military systems couldn't be upgraded. China knows this, which is why they've built the world's largest navy and conduct increasingly aggressive military drills around the island. In response, the United States has deepened its commitment to Taiwan's defense, creating a volatile situation where the world's 2 superpowers are locked in an increasingly dangerous standoff. If war erupts here, it would likely begin with China implementing a blockade, cutting Taiwan off from fuel, food imports, and the ability to export its crucial semiconductors. The US would face an impossible choice: intervene militarily against a nuclear power or abandon a democratic ally and watch global supply chains collapse. Japan, which sits just 67 miles from Taiwan, would be immediately drawn in. Australia, South Korea, and other regional allies would face tremendous pressure to pick sides. Within days, this local conflict could engulf the entire Pacific region. But Taiwan isn't the only flashpoint in Asia. Imagine fighting a war where the enemy isn't just the opposing army, but nature itself, where oxygen is so scarce that soldiers pass out during patrols, where temperatures plummet to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing equipment and causing frostbite within minutes, where the terrain is so rugged that troops must climb thousands of feet just to reach their outposts. This is daily life along the line of actual control, the disputed 2,100-mile border between India and China that winds through the Himalayas. It's the world's highest battlefield, with confrontations occurring at elevations of up to 14,000 feet. In 1962, these nations fought a brutal border war that left thousands dead. You might think this old conflict would have cooled in the 21st century, but you'd be wrong. In June 2020, Indian and Chinese troops engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the Galwan Valley. 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese troops died, fighting not with high-tech weapons, but with rocks and clubs wrapped in barbed wire. Why were they fighting with such primitive weapons? Because both sides had agreed not to carry firearms along the border to prevent escalation. That's how volatile this region is. Even the militaries themselves recognize they're sitting on a powder keg. This isn't just about barren mountain peaks. The Himalayan watershed provides water to nearly 1.5 billion people across South and East Asia. Control of these highlands means control of Asia's water future in an increasingly drought-prone world. Both countries have been racing to build infrastructure along the border. China has constructed a network of all-weather roads, allowing them to rapidly deploy troops even in winter. They've built airfields capable of supporting fighter jets and bombers. India has responded by deploying its mountain warfare specialists and constructing its own military infrastructure. A full-scale war between India and China would pit the world's two largest armies against each other, involving nations that together account for 1/3 of humanity. Both possess nuclear weapons. Both have national pride deeply invested in these territorial claims. But perhaps most dangerous of all, both are rising powers with something to prove. Neither wants to show weakness, neither can afford to back down. And as if two nuclear-armed Asian giants facing off wasn't enough to worry about, let's turn to an even more immediate threat. For decades after World War II, Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, a heavily militarized border separating Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe from the democratic West. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that boundary seemed to dissolve overnight. But today, a new dividing line has emerged, and it's potentially more dangerous than the original Cold War frontier. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, three former Soviet republics, now form NATO's eastern edge. These small nations share borders directly with Russia, creating a geopolitical tripwire. Under NATO's Article 5, an attack on any member nation is considered an attack on all. This means if Russian troops cross into any Baltic state, the entire alliance, including the United States, is obligated to respond militarily. Adding to this tension is Kaliningrad, a heavily militarized Russian exclave sandwiched between Poland and Lithuania. Though small, Kaliningrad hosts Russia's Baltic Fleet and nuclear-capable Iskander missiles that can reach Berlin in minutes. NATO has responded by deploying multinational battle groups throughout the Baltics and Poland. These aren't large enough to stop a full Russian invasion, but they serve as a tripwire, ensuring that any conflict would immediately involve troops from major NATO powers, including the US, UK, Germany, and France. If conflict erupts here, it would unfold with frightening speed. Russian forces could potentially overrun the Baltic states within 60 hours, according to war games conducted by the RAND Corporation. NATO would then face a terrible choice: accept the loss of member states or launch a counteroffensive against entrenched Russian positions, risking nuclear escalation. And unlike distant conflicts in Asia, a European war would immediately impact global markets, energy supplies, and information networks. Stock markets would crash, energy prices would skyrocket, supply chains would unravel overnight. If you've ever ordered products online or filled your car with gas, you've relied on the South China Sea. Though you may never have thought about these waters, they're the maritime crossroads of the global economy. Over $5.3 trillion in international trade, about 1/3 of global shipping, passes through the South China Sea annually. It's also home to rich fishing grounds that feed millions and potentially vast underwater oil and gas reserves. 6 nations, China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, have overlapping claims in these waters. But China has gone furthest to assert control, claiming almost 90% of the sea through its 9-line boundary. To enforce these claims, China has undertaken one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history, turning tiny reefs and rocks into full-fledged islands. Since 2013, Chinese dredgers have piled sand onto remote outcrops, creating over 3,200 acres of new land. These aren't peaceful vacation resorts. They're forward military bases with runways long enough for bombers, deep water ports for warships, and missile systems that can target aircraft and ships throughout the region. The United States and its allies have responded with freedom of navigation operations, sending warships through waters claimed by China to demonstrate they remain international. Each passage risks confrontation. Chinese vessels have repeatedly harassed American ships, sometimes coming within yards of collision. War here might begin with a seemingly minor incident, perhaps a collision between vessels or an attempt to enforce territorial claims against a fishing boat. But with so many nations' prestige and economic interests at stake, escalation could be rapid. China could declare an air defense identification zone over the entire sea, demanding all aircraft request permission to enter. The US would likely challenge this immediately. If shots were fired, even accidentally, the world's 2 largest military powers could find themselves in direct combat for the first time since the Korean War. Speaking of Korea, the Korean War never officially ended. The fighting stopped with an armistice in 1953, but no peace treaty was ever signed. Today, the Korean Demilitarized Zone, the most heavily fortified border on Earth, separates North and South Korea. This 2.5-mile wide buffer is a surreal landscape of landmines, tank traps, listening posts, and guard towers. It's also home to some of the world's largest military concentrations. North Korea has positioned thousands of artillery pieces within range of Seoul, a megacity of 25 million people that sits just 35 miles from the border. What makes this standoff particularly dangerous is North Korea's nuclear arsenal. Despite being one of the world's poorest countries, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and missiles capable of reaching the continental United States. Their program continues to advance despite international sanctions. The Korean situation is further complicated by the involvement of major powers. South Korea hosts nearly 30,000 American troops. China, though often frustrated with North Korea, views it as a buffer state and would likely intervene if the regime collapsed, or if American forces approach the Chinese border. War could erupt here through miscalculation or desperation. If North Korea's regime felt threatened, perhaps by economic collapse or internal power struggles, it might lash out. Within the first hours, North Korean artillery could kill tens of thousands in Seoul. American and South Korean forces would respond with overwhelming force. China would face enormous pressure to intervene, potentially bringing two nuclear superpowers into direct conflict. Japan, within missile range of North Korea, would be drawn in. The human and economic costs would be catastrophic. These flashpoints aren't isolated dangers. They're interconnected threats that could trigger global catastrophe. Unlike past wars, modern conflicts would spread at lightning speed. Markets crashing in seconds, supply chains collapsing within days, and cyber attacks potentially crippling entire societies. The risk isn't just military confrontation, but a complex web of miscalculation, opportunism, and technological vulnerability. Yet hope exists. Diplomatic channels, economic interdependence, and our unprecedented global awareness offer a counterweight to potential conflict.